Throughout the summer of 1988, American military personnel stationed on the European mainland were excited about the possibility of the Cold War coming to a close. But at one West German airbase, the conflict still had one last terrifying incident to inflict upon the hapless defenders. Join us as we relate a close encounter with the Monster of Morbach. Despite the best efforts of their superiors, it was proving increasingly difficult to suppress the growing sense of elation amongst the rank and file of the 50th Tactical Fighter Wing. And whilst by day the airmen of the various fighter squadrons operating out of Hahn Air Force Base continued to maintain their fleet of F-16 interceptors, their behaviour during nighttime hours was becoming progressively undisciplined. The Soviet Premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, was continuing to make very public efforts to increase the level of democracy within his government. Alongside this, rumours swirled that the coming Summer Olympic Games, which were due to take place in South Korea, would be the first time that both the USA and USSR would compete internationally in nearly a decade. Such optimistic tidings had naturally resulted in higher spirits among the servicemen and women as they socialised away from their base. The number of incidents involving drunken personnel had increased significantly, and it seemed like there was now an unending stream of disgraced airmen being escorted back to the facility by an ever more weary section of security officers. One evening, as a group of particularly boisterous flight technicians were being driven back to the station, they demanded that their driver stop so that they could answer a call of nature. The bus which was carrying them promptly came to a halt just outside the village of Venegorat, where several of the passengers disembarked in order to relieve themselves. Having wandered a short distance down the road away from their transport, the intoxicated airmen stumbled across a simple stone shrine, situated not far inside the tree line. Inside, the bemused Americans found a number of candles which appeared to have recently burned out, leaving the small monument unlit. Rather than relighting them, the men instead mocked the odd-looking structure, and then continued on their way. As the bus pulled off again in order to resume its journey, its passengers had no way of knowing that they would ultimately be to blame for one of the most inexplicable and mysterious incidents to befall an American military unit during the Cold War. By allowing the flames to remain extinguished within the Venegorat shrine, they had unwittingly unleashed a terrifying force which they could not possibly comprehend. At approximately 12:15 AM that same night, the guardroom at Hahn Air Force Base received a report of a disturbance, emanating from a wooded area located not far from the base's perimeter fencing. One of the security teams patrolling nearby had overheard what appeared to be a shrill screaming, coming from in amongst the trees, followed by the sounds of someone apparently moving around in the foliage. A secondary patrol was immediately dispatched, and two teams made their way outside the perimeter fence and into the trees beyond. The men had not travelled far when they came across a grisly sight. Lying out in the open clearing were the bodies of 3 horrifically mutilated deer. By the light of their torches, the airmen could see that each animal had its throat torn open and had sustained severe, gaping injuries to their torsos. When the servicemen moved in for a closer inspection, it became clear that someone or something had been rummaging around the innards of the dead animals. Pools of blood and exposed entrails around the wounds, as well as patches of trampled grass heading away from the remains, suggested that their attacker had feasted upon the internal organs of its victims before making good its escape. Assuming that the hapless creatures had died at the hands of either boars or wild dogs, the decision was made to place a phone call into the local forestry commission, so that one of their staff could come and remove the bodies. Once this request had been passed along back at the base, the duty officer had then settled back into his seat, preparing himself for another uneventful evening. But it was at this point that the base's radio network suddenly exploded into life. Out in the forest, the the two patrols had been on the verge of returning to the airbase when they had heard a low and throaty growl coming from some nearby bushes. As one of the men went over to investigate, a huge figure had exploded from the undergrowth, bellowing forth a guttural roar. Dropping his torch in fright, the airman had immediately made off, quickly followed by his compatriots. Upon their return to the base, the two security teams were asked what they had encountered, replying that they thought they had been attacked by a bear. Their superior was indignant, pointing out that it had been a century since the last Eurasian bear had been seen in the country. Assuming that his men had simply misidentified what they had witnessed due to darkness and their nerves, he began to make inquiries as to whether any of the base's canine units had been out in the area at the same time. When it was confirmed that they hadn't, the officer requested that one be dispatched to the guardhouse, so that it could accompany the two security teams as they made their way back into the forest. One of the base's dog handlers duly arrived with his German Shepherd, and then followed the patrol back to the point near the perimeter fence, where they had entered the adjoining woodland. As they moved just inside the tree line, the dog suddenly began to act erratically, whining and pulling violently at its lead, refusing to go any further. Several attempts were made to pull the dog forwards, but it point-blank refused, eventually leading its handler and the two security teams back onto the base and quickly retreating to its kennels. Suddenly, sirens began to ring out, and men began to pile out of buildings, heading for their muster points. A vehicle patrol further along the fence line from the guard room had caught sight of a figure moving around by one of the munitions lockers. They had immediately chased after the intruder, only for it to make off at speed, disappearing in and out of the shadows around the buildings it was moving between. For the next 20 minutes, ground teams and jeeps continued to pursue the intruder in and around the base, none seeming to be able to get close enough to identify it. Some of the men reported that they had followed the figure into a dead end, only to find it had disappeared, despite being surrounded by high walls or fencing on all sides. Further efforts had been made to deploy canine units, but the handlers reported that they had been unable to coax any of the animals from the safety of their kennels. Eventually, the decision was made to cut the power to the base's external lighting, and for night vision goggles to be distributed amongst the men hunting for this mysterious interloper. The patrols were lined up at one end of the base, and then fanned out into a line, pushing the intruder back towards the fence line. The officer in command of the maneuver was conscious of the fact that his men were on edge, and carrying live ammunition, but saw little alternative to ending the situation. The men lying in wait at the fence could hear the sounds of yelling and shouting getting progressively louder, as the patrols hunting the stranger drew ever closer to them. And then, suddenly, a dark shape sprang from the shadows. In a heartbeat, it had passed right by them, pitching itself up and over the 9-foot metal fence that the men had been standing next to. The sergeant in charge of the team had then used his night vision goggles to scan the trees for any sign of the fleeing figure, and the blood in his veins suddenly turned ice cold. Standing bolt upright on its hind legs was what appeared to be a huge wolf-like entity. This creature stared back at him for what seemed like an eternity, before emitting a loud howl and then fleeing back into the trees. As daylight approached, further searches of the adjoining woodland were unsuccessful in locating the intruder, other than to find broken branches and trampled grass where it had apparently made good its escape. When the forest ranger who had been called for finally arrived, he was ultimately unable to identify what had killed the 3 deer. When asked if it may have been a wolf, he agreed that the injuries were consistent with such an attack, but he was keen to point out that wolves usually killed their prey from shock, with a lightning-quick attack. This usually resulted in little to no blood loss, and the animals would then begin to feast upon their quarry from the hindquarters up, rather than with such overt savagery. When the bodies of the deer had been recovered, the airmen returned to the airfield to discuss the night's events. Nothing of significance had been captured on the poor quality CCTV covering the base, save for groups of airmen running around haphazardly and brandishing their weapons. Alcohol and drug screening tests were also carried out on the personnel involved, all of which subsequently came back negative. A detailed report of the incident was duly submitted, though the testimony of the only sergeant who had sighted the intruder was heavily sanitized. No reference was made to its lupine appearance, and it was only in the coming days and weeks that rumors of links between the incident and the shrine that the technicians had encountered that evening finally came to light. Beyond being one of 18 other settlements that form the Greater Morbach municipality, the town of Venegarat has left little footprint in the history of the Rhineland. Prior to the formation of the United States airbase and munitions facility there in the aftermath of World War II, the most notable story to come from the region is that of a Napoleonic infantryman named Thomas Schwitzer. In the aftermath of the failed attempt to take Moscow, many of Napoleon's vanquished soldiers fled his army, returning to the safety of their home nations. Having fallen in with a group of Russian deserters, Schwitzer had made his way back to his homeland in the Alsace. But as he and his fellow fugitives had passed through the region of Morbach, any semblance of normality had quickly left their group. Half-starved and driven mad by the horrors they had witnessed, the desperate soldiers had occupied a local farmhouse, killing the occupants. As the wife of the family had lay dying, she had cursed Schwitzer, condemning him to roam the land as a monster whenever there was a full moon. Ignoring this proclamation, the soldier had murdered the woman, but soon found an uncontrollable change taking hold of him. As his journey home continued, Schwitzer became more and more unhinged. His levels of violence and depravity began to shock the men travelling with him, and he was soon left alone to roam the countryside. Rumours began to persist of a savage beast, killing cattle and livestock whenever there was a full moon. Eventually, a group of local farmers located and confronted the fugitive, killing him near the village of Venegarat. Prior to his murder, it was alleged that the soldier had forced himself upon a number of local women, fathering several children. Fearing that these unfortunate souls would be afflicted by the same curse which had destroyed Schwitzer, the villagers constructed a simple stone shrine near their home, ensuring that a candle was always burning within it. As long as the shrine remained lit, the curse could not be realized. The legend of the Venegarat werewolf by no means stands alone in German folklore. Throughout the nation's past, numerous stories can be found of inhabitants who have uncovered the ability to transform themselves into a murderous beast. In many of these cases, this was achieved by wearing a belt or cloak made from the pelt of a predatory animal. The most celebrated of these tales is that of the Bedborg beast, which transpired in 1582. Amidst the horrors of the Black Death, the authorities began investigating a series of mysterious cattle mutilations. When these incidents escalated to the slaying of local residents, the army began to delve deeper into the mystery, detaining a prominent businessman named Peter Stubber. Under interrogation, the unrepentant Stubber confessed to the murder of 13 children and 2 pregnant women. He told his captors that he had been able to turn into a nightmarish wolf-like beast in order to carry out the killings, using a belt that had been handed to him by the devil himself. His subsequent execution by church officials would prove more savage than any of his crimes, as he was dismembered with an axe and then burned at the stake as he bled to death. With this in mind, are we to believe that on a quiet summer's evening during the late 1980s, the United States Air Force found itself under siege from a mythical monster. That despite being in possession of the most up-to-date technology of their day, they could not capture an individual who was running rampant across their facility, having been afflicted by an ancient curse. As ever, the argument is presented by skeptics that young soldiers, stationed in an unfamiliar environment and far away from their friends and family, can experience a range of overwhelming emotions. These feelings, when combined with the fear caused by an ongoing and protracted conflict, along with the tension of a nighttime setting, can naturally lead to those involved to imagine things that have not taken place. That said, occurrences such as the Morbach monster are intriguingly common throughout the history of America's armed forces. We have already examined the Rendlesham Forest incident, and in future episodes, we will document and explore the various monsters and cryptids that servicemen reported encountering during the Vietnam War. So, if you are to glean anything from this tale, it's to take the time to educate yourself on the customs and practices of any environment you may find yourself in, because you never know when the sins of the past may suddenly decide to pay an unexpected visit to the present.